Okay, welcome to the first objective of our westward expansion unit, the Texas Revolution. You can see your I can statement there, your objective for this podcast. I can summarize the Texas Revolution and explain its historical significance. So at the end of this podcast, that's what you need to be able to do. Now, just like the United States, Mexico was at one time ruled by a European country. However, instead of being ruled by England or Great Britain, and speaking English like the United States does, Mexico was ruled by Spain, which is why people from Mexico speak Spanish. They don't speak Mexican. Mexican isn't actually a language. They speak Spanish, because at one time they were ruled by Spain. Now, the Mexican Revolution actually began way back in 1810, while the U.S. was in the middle of the Embargo Act passed by Thomas Jefferson that we learned about. That's back before the War of 1812, when the United States was getting caught in the middle of the trading between Britain and France. At that time, Mexico had actually started its revolution under a guy named Father Hidalgo. Mexico fought for their independence for 11 years before they finally won it. The fighting had kind of died down around 1816, 1818, and doesn't pick up again until about 1819 or 1821, when Mexico finally wins its Revolutionary War against Spain 2 years after the United States gained Florida. And as you can see by looking at this map from 1821, this is a map of North America. The area that is in dark blue was the United States, and the lighter blue was sort of territory that was owned by the United States but wasn't yet an actual state yet. You can see Florida hadn't become a state yet, neither had most of the Louisiana territory. But the green color there is the land that was either part of the country of Mexico or was territory owned by Mexico. And you can see Mexico was actually bigger than the United States after it won its revolution. Everything that you see up there in yellow was, it's now Canada, but it was at the time controlled by Great Britain. So the North American continent was mostly under the control of three different countries: Mexico, Great Britain, and the United States. After the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, Spain had closed Texas to American settlers. So American settlers weren't allowed to enter into Texas anymore. America had originally argued over that territory, if you remember, but part of the Adams-Onis Treaty when we gained Florida is that we gave up our claim to Texas, and Spain closed Texas to American settlers. However, after Mexico gained control of that territory, Mexico won their revolution, they kind of opened up the doors again to American settlers. They just said that those any settlers coming into Texas had to agree to become Mexican citizens, and they had to practice the Catholic religion, which also outlawed slaveries. This was tough because most of the new settlers that were coming into this territory, into Texas, ignored these laws because they were cotton farmers who wanted to bring slaves into Texas and turn it into cotton farms. One of the Americans who brought in a lot of settlers into Texas was named Stephen Austin. The capital of Texas is named after him now, Austin, Texas. Austin was granted a land grant by the Mexican government, and he was allowed to bring in American settlers into Texas. Austin worked very hard, and he ended up attracting about 300 families into his new colony. So Austin packs up 300 families in wagons, most of whom, again, were looking to begin cotton fields in Texas. And they move in and begin an American colony in Spanish or in Mexican territory in Texas. Around this time, a new leader in the Mexican government emerges, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And while most of the Mexican government hadn't been happy about the American settlers not following their rules, refusing to become Catholic, still continuing to have slaves, refusing to become Mexican citizens, the Mexican government hadn't been happy about that, but Santa Anna was just furious about it. Santa Anna started off as a general in the Mexican army, and then eventually he becomes dictator and throws out the Mexican Constitution, and he starts demanding that all the new settlers follow Mexican laws. He was afraid that the U.S. was going to try to annex or add on Texas, which they were. That was one of the reasons why a lot of Americans, while the American government was encouraging American settlers to go and set up colonies in Texas. So Santa Anna was right, and he was right that the American settlers weren't following his laws. However, Americans that were living in Texas weren't happy with Santa Anna, and especially not happy with him trying to force them to become Mexican citizens, outlaw slavery, or force them to become Catholic. And they begin recruiting the help of Tejanos, people who are of Spanish or Mexican heritage. They speak the Spanish language, but they live in Texas, and they kind of identify more with being from Texas than they do with being Mexican or being Spanish. And the Americans that are there begin recruiting their help. In 1835, Texans in the town of Gonzales clash with Mexican troops. Stephen Austin and Sam Houston lead the rebellion as the Republic of Texas declares its independence from the Republic of Mexico. Now, once Americans in the United States begin hearing about the Texas Revolution, they begin running by the thousands to Texas to try to help them win their revolution against Mexico and become their own country. There were a lot of battles that happened during the Texas Revolution, but one of the most important one is the battle at the Alamo. The Alamo was an old Spanish mission, or like a really old church that had been abandoned for a long time. And at the Alamo, there are about 150 Texans who kind of hold up and make a makeshift fort when they hear that the Mexican army is coming. They ask for help, they send for help, the help doesn't arrive. They end up holding off about 6,000 Mexican troops for 13 days with just 150 of them. But eventually, all of the Texans who are fighting at the Alamo are killed, including the women and children were allowed to go, but at a smaller battle kind of down the road from the Alamo, a lot of prisoners of war were executed by Santana and the Mexican army. Now, because of this, the Alamo becomes a very inspirational symbol for the Texas Revolution, and the war cry of "Remember the Alamo" becomes a very famous phrase. It still means, it's still a very heartfelt saying to Texans today, as a symbol of courage and of bravery for those 150 Texans who were able to hold off 6,000 Mexican troops for 13 days. Using the inspiration of the phrase "Remember the Alamo," the Texans are finally able to defeat the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto. They defeat Santa Anna and force him to sign a treaty granting their independence. Mexico later refuses to recognize this treaty, claiming that Santa Anna was afraid for his life and he was forced to sign it. So they refuse to acknowledge Texas as becoming its own country, and Mexico continues to claim that Texas is part of Mexico even after the Republic of Texas exists on its own for 9 years. Despite what Mexico thought at the time, the Republic of Texas was its own country. They become nicknamed the Lone Star Republic because of their ties to the United States, but they only had one star on their flag because they were all by themselves. Sam Houston becomes their first president. He has the city of Houston, Texas, named after him. The Lone Star Republic was nearly bankrupt. They had major economic problems. They had a tough time making money. They were really kind of caught in the middle between Mexico, the United States, and the Comanche Indians who had lived on that land all along. Pretty much as soon as they became their own country, Texan President Sam Houston applies to the United States for statehood, asking to become made a state along with his Secretary of State, Stephen Austin. But the U.S. is really kind of unsure if they want to add Texas right now. They're worried about a potential war with Mexico, plus there was a lot of argument in Congress about would Texas be added as a free state or a slave state. If you remember when we talked about when Missouri was added as a state, there was a lot of that argument that they settled with the Missouri Compromise. So people in the South argued then the Missouri Compromise settles it, Texas is a slave state. But many Northerners who were anti-slavery weren't willing to agree to that. So Texas kind of has to hang on by itself for 9 years, caught in the middle again between Mexico, the United States, and the Comanche Indians, trying to wait and see if the United States is going to add them as a state, while the United States tries to figure out if it's worth going to war with Mexico and how they're going to handle the issue about slavery. Now, if you would do me a favor and take a few minutes to review the "I can" statement at the beginning of the video. Can you summarize the Texas Revolution and explain its historical significance? Think about other questions that Mr. Clements might ask you during oral defense. What are they? Can you answer them? Kind of try to practice in your head a little bit about what oral defense over this objective might feel like. And then finally, kind of take your notes or kind of go back through the podcast and create some sort of graphic organizer, a thought web or an outline about the information that you think is most important from this podcast. Be sure to include the key vocabulary terms that you can find under Objective 1 on your unit sheet.